Hi, how you doing? Mike Cooley. I'm going to be giving a brief description of the Gospel of Judas and try to answer how the Gospel presented Jesus, how it presented or portrayed the disciples, how it related to the New Testament Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and if it had any kind of theological influence on canon or canonical Gospels. So, the Gospel of Judas was found about 100 miles south of Cairo. It was carbon dated around the 3rd or 4th century. However, they believe that it was older than that, and that it was actually a copy of the original, which they believe was actually written around the 2nd century. It's similar to structure and the same number of pages as the letters to the Ephesians from the Apostle Paul. Now, when I first read it, I was assuming that the Gospel of Judas would be similar to the New Testament Gospels, being the good news. However, it didn't really take on that that tone or that theme. It was actually pretty angry, but maybe that's just my interpretation. But the gospel was broken down into two main parts. It was conversations between the disciples. But the first part was between Jesus and the 12 disciples, and then the second part was between Jesus and Judas by themselves. The initial impression is that Judas, he's getting a lot more attention than the other disciples. Now, the central message of the gospel was the secret knowledge that was to be revealed to Judas, and apparently Judas already had that secret knowledge, and he knew who Jesus was and knew where he came from, and because of this, Jesus took notice of that and then actually had him separate from the 12 disciples so that he could continue to teach him this secret knowledge. Now, by gaining this knowledge, it would therefore separate him from the corrupt world and the shackles of this world. He would be released from them and be able to return to the great invisible spirit, or the great light, or spiritual light. There were several terms for it. It presents Jesus in a similar manner as the Gospels. However, in the reading, he does come across as not a nice teacher. He was consistently laughing at them, mocking them for their actions in 3 of the conversations, which is made up of the first part of the gospel. He did perform wonders. He did work wonders. He healed people. He was a teacher. He did bring salvation to humanity because he was crucified. They don't go into the crucifixion story really much in any detail at all. They don't really talk about him sacrificing or talking about him talking about his death. However, he does, in his 3 separate conversations that he has, he's continually, I would say, berating the disciples, but he doesn't act like the loving teacher that he was in the New Testament Gospels. He additionally had the ability to be able to change his appearance into a child. So that kind of plays into the Docetism theological viewpoint that he was. It doesn't really talk about his humanity so much, and in fact, he talks against or speaks against humanity in the flesh, and saying, he talks down about it, and it talks more about the spiritual plane, because he had the ability to be able to. He was constantly moving back and forth. There's one point where a conversation he has with the disciples where he talks about I was with a greater and holier race or a group of people than you, meaning the disciples, which kind of irked the disciples, and they felt really bad about it because they, well, who's better than us, and that could probably be attributed to them as arrogance, but he quickly would laugh at them and then continue to mock them. Not so much in the languages, but in the tone of the reading. Again, with that Docetic theme, him being able to change his appearance into a child, they weren't able to recognize him. So, how does that relate to the scripture, and as far as them recognizing who he was? And again, Judas said that he knew who he was. He recognized that he was from another realm, and to the immortal Barbello, which is talked about in Gnostic beliefs, and the Gnostics, I should say. However, Mark, in the Gospel of Mark, Peter identified him as Jesus Christ, whereas in the Gospel of Judas, Seth is identified as Christ. So there's a definite contradiction to each other in who is the actual Christ. But ultimately, I found that the conversations that they had between each other didn't show the love that he expressed in the New Testament. He did not express the message of suffering and sacrifice and his relationship with the Father. There was not any of that conversation at all. It seemed rather centered on what Judas was going to do. And then, of course, the betrayal aspect of it, which was the final piece of the book itself, where basically it wasn't very long. It wasn't a long piece. You thought there would be, I thought that there'd be more of detail on that. However, I believe the last sentence was he was, the scribes were watching for him. They found him. And when they found him, they approached him, and he was given 30 copper coins, and then he turned over Jesus to them. So I didn't go into great detail. So the question is Judas a hero of the story? Is he the unsung hero by taking the necessary steps and being the individual who actually identified Jesus for who he really was? So that's my question to y'all.